Welcome back to the deep dive. One topic we get asked about all the time is the Singapore story. How did this tiny island nation go from, like, a poor, decrepit colony to, quote, Kofi Annan to, to the shining, rich, and modern metropolis it is today? It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's a story that captures the imagination for sure. And I think for this deep dive, what we really want to focus on are those specific areas that our listeners keep bringing up. Like, how did they grow their economy so fast? How does this whole CPF thing work? And how they use it to tackle housing and healthcare. And then there's the clean government thing. And of course, how they managed to create such racial harmony. Oh, and we should definitely get into the why behind these choices, because the strategies they used were often, well, pretty bold, you could say.
Exactly. And we've got a fantastic primary source to guide us. Lee Kuan Yew's own book, From Third World to First. It's his account of those pivotal years, 1965 to 2000, when Singapore was finding its feet. Talk about a front row seat to history. But, okay, first things first. The economic miracle. I mean, right after independence in 65, things looked pretty dire, right?
And dire is an understatement. Lee Kuan Yew himself talks about how a lot of the foreign press basically wrote them off. I mean, you had folks like Dennis Warner in the Sydney Morning Herald and Richard Hughes in the London Sunday Times, and they were predicting, like, straight-up economic collapse.
Wow.
Yeah, no natural resources, the loss of the Malaysian hinterland, which had been a key economic partner, and then the British military bases were pulling out. That was a big employer back then. Many people just didn't think Singapore could make it on its own.
Bleak hardly covers it. So how did they turn things around so dramatically? I mean, to defy those predictions?
Well, they made a really deliberate, pragmatic decision. Attracting foreign investment was going to be key. Now, at first, you had entrepreneurs coming in from Taiwan and Hong Kong, but they were mostly bringing in low-tech industries, textiles, toy manufacturing, that kind of thing. The real game changer was when they shifted focus to American multinational corporations, MNCs. These brought in higher technology and could operate on a much larger scale. They needed a lot of workers, which was crucial.
Makes sense, aiming for those higher value industries, the ones with more growth potential and more jobs, obviously.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about offering a location. Singapore really tailored its environment. Low taxes, efficient bureaucracy, no getting bogged down in red tape, and a workforce trained in the skills these companies needed.
Smart. It's like they were creating the perfect recipe for success.
Right. And thinking long-term, too. They knew this wasn't just about quick wins. This was about positioning Singapore as a vital part of the global technology supply chain.
And they didn't just focus on manufacturing, did they? Singapore also became a major player in the financial world.
Yeah, that was really strategic. A big step there was setting up SIMEX, the Singapore International Monetary Exchange. So this is basically a marketplace for financial futures, contracts for things like currencies or commodities that are going to be delivered in the future.
Oh, right, like betting on what the price of something will be down the line.
Exactly. It lets investors manage risk, and it's also a way to, well, speculate. A crucial piece of becoming a sophisticated financial center. And CIMEX grew like crazy. It became a big deal in the world of financial futures.
Yeah, I remember reading that they even won International Exchange of the Year from the International Financing Review. And they weren't just a one-hit wonder.
No, not at all. They won it 4 times. And they were the first Asian exchange to get that award. By 1998, it was clear. Singapore was a serious force in global finance.
Okay, so they're attracting investment, they're becoming a financial hub, they're generating wealth. Then comes the GIC.
The Government of Singapore Investment Corporation.
Yeah, what was the thinking behind that one?
This is where you really see their foresight. As the reserves grew, mostly from the CPF, we'll talk about that more, and from public sector surpluses. Well, the existing monetary authority of Singapore wasn't really set up to handle these large-scale, long-term investments, investments aimed at maximizing returns over time.
Makes sense.
So in 1981, boom, the GIC is born. Lee Kuan Yew himself was chairman, and Goh Keng Swee was his deputy. And they weren't messing around. They brought in experts from N.M. Rothschild and Sons to help set it all up.
Wow, really serious about it.
Yeah, and they hired American and British investment managers, top-notch talent. They knew they needed professional long-term management of those national funds.
Makes sense. So we've got the financial foundations in place, but then you need the people, right? A skilled and reliable workforce to make all this growth actually happen.
Absolutely. Lee Kuan Yew talks about how stable industrial relations were just crucial. In those early years, there were some protests against policy changes from the National Trades Union Congress, the NTUC, and the leadership had this really tricky balancing act. They had to convince the unions that for Singapore to survive, to thrive, they needed to prioritize stability.
Stability over what?
Well, over things like immediate massive wage increases. It was about ensuring productivity, minimizing disruptions, that kind of thing, because they were in such a precarious position.
I can see how that would be a tough sell.
Yeah. But they also took concrete steps to make things fairer. They reformed trade union practices, got rid of things that were hindering productivity, like restrictive practices and abuse of fringe benefits.
So it wasn't just work harder, get paid less. It was more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. And Lee Kuan Yew, he openly said they'd learned from Britain's economic troubles, which were partly blamed on, those crippling dock strikes and things like that.
Yeah.
He basically told the NTUC that any similar action in Singapore's port would be considered, and I quote, high treason.
Wow. Strong words.
Yeah. The point was keeping that port running smoothly was absolutely vital. They needed to be seen as reliable, efficient, attractive to international businesses.
Okay, and then there's the whole British withdrawal thing. Talk about a curveball. But they seem to handle that pretty smoothly, too.
Right. Another example of their adaptability. When the British announced they were pulling out, instead of panicking or demanding aid, Singapore just got to work.
What do you mean?
They set up the base's economic conversion department. The focus was on retraining the workers who were going to lose their jobs, finding new uses for the land, and buildings the British were leaving behind.
So turning a potential crisis into an opportunity, essentially.
Exactly. And they were smart about it. Lee Kuan Yew talks about how they even asked the British to leave any usable equipment or materials behind instead of just destroying them.
Practical, right?
Very. And this long-term thinking went beyond just reacting to events. It also shaped their approach to infrastructure planning, like with the Changi Airport decision.
Ah, that's a great example. In 1972, the cabinet actually agreed to build a second runway at Paya Lebar Airport. That was the existing airport at the time.
Right.
But then the oil crisis hit in 73, and things got a lot more uncertain, economically speaking. And Lee Kuan Yew, he started to have second thoughts.
I can see why.
Yeah. So he pushes for a reassessment. They bring in some American consultants for a fresh perspective. And even though those consultants recommended going ahead with the Paya Lebar expansion,
She wasn't convinced, nope.
he really pushed for a much bolder, more ambitious option, building a whole new world-class airport at Changi.
And that's the Changi Airport we know and love today. Precisely. Willing to reconsider plans, even when everyone's already on board, if it means a better long-term outcome. Very typical of Singapore's approach.
Okay, so we've covered some of those early economic strategies. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the CPF. It's a pretty unique system, and it plays a huge role in things like housing and healthcare. What's the deal with that?
The Central Provident Fund, or CPF, it's essentially a mandatory savings plan. Everyone who's working, both employees and employers, contribute. And yeah, it started as a national pension scheme, but it became so much more than that. By 1998, millions of people were using their CPF savings, not just for retirement, but also to buy homes, invest in property, and even just make investments.
Wow, it's really woven into the fabric of their society.
It is, and Lee Kuan Yew is very clear about the thinking behind it. They wanted to avoid what they saw as the downsides of the welfare state. They'd looked at what was happening in places like Britain and Sweden, and they felt that when governments become the primary provider for everything, it could have some unintended consequences, like people become less motivated, less self-reliant. And it can create a culture of dependency on the state.
So the CPF was a way to create a safety net without, creating that dependency.
Exactly. Social Security, yes, but with an emphasis on individual responsibility. And one of the most impactful ways they used the CPF was in housing.
That was a huge part of their nation-building strategy, wasn't it?
Huge. They let citizens use their CPF savings to buy homes, particularly through the HDB, the Housing and Development Board. This gave people like a literal stake in the country's success, a sense of ownership.
Really clever, actually.
Right. And it's tied to their goals for racial harmony, too. They deliberately mixed races within HDB estates, making sure there weren't these huge racial enclaves like they had under British rule.
Fascinating. So social policy is serving an economic and, I guess, a social cohesion purpose. And the CPF is also linked to healthcare, which is pretty unusual.
Yeah. In 1975, Lee Kuan Yew proposed this idea called MediSave. Basically, part of your CPF contributions would go into this special account specifically for medical expenses. yours and your family's.
Interesting. So kind of like a health savings account?
In a way, yeah. And the thinking was it would make people think twice before overusing healthcare services. They'd seen problems in systems where healthcare was completely free.
Oh, right. People might go to the doctor for every little sniffle.
Yeah, exactly. So MetaSave was about encouraging a more responsible approach to healthcare, a more sustainable one.
It all seems very interconnected, their thinking.
Very much so. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about governance. Everyone knows Singapore has a reputation for being squeaky clean when it comes to corruption. How'd they pull that off?
Yeah, that always impressed me.
Well, from day one, tackling corruption was a top priority. They knew it could undermine everything they were trying to build. So they started by strengthening their anti-corruption laws.
Like what?
As early as 1960, they made some big changes. Widened the definition of gratuity. Basically, anything of value could be considered a bribe. And they gave more power to the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, the CPIB.
What kind of powers?
Well, for one, they could investigate people's bank accounts. This is a big one. They got rid of the requirement to prove that the person taking the bribe could actually deliver the favor they'd promised.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that made it a lot easier to get convictions. Before, you'd have to prove, that this official actually had the power to do what they were being bribed to do. Now it didn't matter. Just taking the bribe was enough.
So they weren't playing around. And it wasn't just about having tough laws on the books, was it?
No, they had a strategy for how to use those laws. Instead of going after every little petty case, they focused on the big fish, high-level corruption.
Sending a message, basically.
Exactly. No one was above the law. And at the same time, for less serious stuff, they tried to simplify things, make bureaucracy less complex, remove opportunities for bribes. Like, they published clear guidelines, got rid of permits where they weren't really needed.
So it was a two-pronged approach. Go after the big guys and make it harder for the little guys to even get tempted.
That's it. And whenever they hit a snag, a loophole or something, they'd just tighten the laws even more. They were constantly adapting.
Smart. And what about elections? How did they keep corruption out of the political process itself?
Lee Kuan Yew actually talks about how they specifically avoided using money to win elections. He pushed for things like compulsory voting, which, reduces the impact of vote buying. And he banned using cars to transport voters to polling stations, which could be another way to influence things.
Makes sense. Leveling the playing field, essentially.
Right. And he points out that even the communists, who were their main rivals, didn't rely heavily on money. The PRP won because they delivered real, tangible benefits. Jobs, housing, education, things people could see and feel the impact of.
Results speak louder than words, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they weren't shy about protecting that reputation. If someone accused them of corruption, especially during an election, they'd sue for defamation. Lee Kuan Yew mentions specific cases he pursued through the courts.
Wow, really going the extra mile to safeguard their integrity?
Yeah, they knew how important it was to maintain public trust.
Okay, last but definitely not least, let's talk about racial harmony. Singapore is incredibly diverse. How did they manage to create such a cohesive society?
This was a massive undertaking,
Yeah.
and they were very deliberate about it. One of their key strategies was racial integration in public housing.
So not letting people self-segregate.
Exactly. Unlike the British, who'd basically allowed different races to live in separate areas, Singapore made sure there was a mix of races in every HDB estate, even within individual apartment blocks.
Breaking down those barriers from the ground up.
That was the idea. Daily interaction, fostering understanding between different communities. And they used urban planning strategically, too.
Like how?
Well, take the Geylang Serai Malay settlement. They redeveloped that area, built new roads and infrastructure to prevent it from becoming a huge, isolated ghetto.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Lee Kuan Yew talks about how they involved Malay MPs in that process, making sure the community's concerns were heard and addressed.
So it wasn't just a top-down approach. They really tried to work with the communities.
Exactly. And then there's the whole language and education issue. Talk about a minefield.
Yeah, how do you even begin to handle that in such a diverse linguistic environment?
Well, they went with English as the common language for administration, business, education. It was seen as neutral. Plus, it was essential for Singapore to be competitive globally.
Makes sense.
But they also recognized the strengths of the Chinese-educated students. Lee Kuan Yew himself made sure his kids learned both English and Mandarin. He even admits there was a lot of pushback against English at first.
I can imagine.
But they knew it was the right call for national unity and economic progress. And of course, they also implemented bilingual education, so kids were learning English plus their own mother tongue.
It all sounds very well thought out, very strategic.
It was. And then you have the whole issue of Singapore's Chinese majority, especially in relation to its neighbors, and of course China itself.
Tricky, tricky.
Yeah. They knew they had to tread carefully there. So they made it very clear that Singapore was independent, that regional stability came before any sense of, ethnic solidarity with China.
So no playing favorites based on ethnicity.
Nope. And they even delayed establishing diplomatic relations with China until after Indonesia had done so. A very deliberate move to avoid any appearance of, putting ethnicity above regional diplomacy.
Wow, that's fascinating. They really thought of everything, didn't they?
They did. And they were also very careful about external events that could potentially stir up racial tensions at home, like the race riots in Kuala Lumpur in 1969.
Oh, right.
They actually brought in media regulations after that to prevent the spread of racist sentiments. They even mentioned the Utusan Melayu paper specifically.
So proactive measures to keep things calm.
Exactly.
So after looking at all of this, all these different strategies across so many different areas, what would you say were the key principles, the underlying rationale behind these choices?
Well, few things stand out. First, they were incredibly pragmatic, always willing to adapt, to learn from what was working or not working, both at home and abroad.
I think we've seen that over and over.
Right. And then a huge emphasis on long-term stability and security. They knew how vulnerable they were being so small. That's what drove their economic policies, their social policies, even their approach to national defense.
Or that mandatory national service, right?
Yeah, even though there was some opposition to that initially, and they knew their people were their greatest asset. So investing in education, in skills development, was a top priority.
Makes sense.
Even some of their more controversial ideas, like Lee Kuan Yew's worries about educated women not marrying and having enough kids, came from this long-term perspective.
Yeah.
It was about ensuring the future of the nation, even if, not everyone agreed with his views.
It was a different time, that's for sure.
Yeah. And another thing, they were very firm about not letting other countries meddle in their internal affairs. Like that whole Hendricks and So incident. They drew a line in the sand there.
Yeah, and they made it clear where that line was.
Exactly. And throughout it all, they were really careful to balance economic growth with social cohesion, make sure everyone benefited, and that progress didn't make existing divisions worse.
It's quite a story, isn't it? A really remarkable transformation.
It is. They took this tiny island nation, facing all these huge challenges, and turned it into a prosperous, stable, global hub. And they did it through these proactive, adaptive policies, economically, socially, politically.
And the CPF, that was a real game changer. The way they used that to tackle housing, healthcare, while also encouraging individual responsibility.
Absolutely. And don't forget about their commitment to clean government, to those carefully considered strategies for building racial harmony. And through it all, this really pragmatic leadership, always focused on the long term, always aware of those initial vulnerabilities.
It makes you think, about what lessons other countries can learn from Singapore's experience.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. It's such a unique context, right? Small, multiracial, multilingual, with this particular history. What parts of their journey, both the successes and the more debatable stuff, can other nations learn from? Especially those facing similar challenges in our world today.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, lots to think about. But that's what we're here for, right? Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.